Okay, so flip the classroom here, and this is what we were going to do in class on Monday, but because of our connectivity issues, everything's got backed up a day. So I would like for you to watch this no later than Monday night, because we're going to get back on track with the syllabus as printed on, looking at the calendar right now, on Thursday. So Monday is documentary day, Tuesday is the Obama versus Putin debate, and then Thursday we're back on track with the syllabus as printed. And so today is about the arguably the greatest of the Islamic empires, the Ottoman Empire. The name is an anglicized name. It is derived from the name of the founder of this dynasty and this empire, Osman, right there. And in Arabic, it's Osmanli. But somehow that got anglicized into Ottoman. What are you going to do? The House of Osman is an ethnically Turkish dynasty. And it has its origins in the southern steppes of what is today Russia, moving to the west in the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. And this rather colorful map here, you can see it more clearly in the slides on the LibGuide side, shows the growth of this state from its original area of influence here in what is today northwestern Turkey, spreading out first into Anatolia, what is today Turkey, then across the Hellespont into what is today Romania and Bulgaria, Greece, and what used to be Yugoslavia, and then encompassing an area that includes almost the entirety of the, what is today the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, North Africa, Libya, Tunisia on west, and a great deal of what is today Europe, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, Albania, Greece, goes on and on and on. This was during the 16th and into the early 17th centuries, arguably the most powerful state in the Western world. And it gets a kickstart, if you will, back in the 15th century by this guy right here, Mehmet II. His reign begins in 1451 as a young man. And when he takes the throne, the state is not nearly as large as it would be. And at its center is a Christian enclave, the city of Constantinople, founded all the way back in the 320s, so over 1,000 years earlier, by Constantine the Great. And it is the redoubt of Christianity here in the East after the initial Arab conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries. It's a city that the Ottoman Turks want, and they besiege it multiple times. It had been besieged back in the 7th and 8th centuries by the Umayyad caliphs, but its walls had withstood the assault, and it had remained an independent city-state in the midst of this first Arab Muslim empire and then Turkish Muslim empire. But in 1453, Mehmet II launches an amazingly powerful assault on the city.
By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire spread from present-day Turkey, known as Anatolia, deep into the Balkans. with one critical exception.
It must have galled the Ottoman Sultan that, with his domains now stretching all the way into Asia and far, far into Europe in the west, there remained right in the center of his domains the greatest prize of all, the capital city of Constantinople, the most powerful, the richest, the most magnetic city in the entire world, still in the hands of the dying but not yet dead Byzantine Empire.
To the Ottomans, Constantinople's strategic and economic importance was considerable. Its symbolic significance was even greater.
It was the city. There was no others. If you were going to rule that area, obviously you would rule it from that city.
It's said that the goal of laying claim to Constantinople was decreed by Muhammad himself. By the middle of the 15th century, the city was a shadow of its former self. The population had plummeted from 400,000 to a mere 50,000. But a besieging army would still be at a tremendous disadvantage. Constantinople was surrounded on three sides by water and massively fortified. It was encircled by a triple ring of walls nearly 100 feet high and 30 feet thick. And they had already stood for 1,000 years. But Mehmed had an answer for these walls.
And part of the military superiority of the Ottomans came from their sophisticated and diverse use of the possibilities of gunpowder. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed the Conqueror saw the first dramatic application of this in the form of huge cannons that had not been seen before, which Mehmed had specially commissioned for the occasion.
Earlier cannons had been assembled with strips of forged metal bound with hoops. They fired stone projectiles with little more power than a catapult. A new breed of cannons could be cast of solid bronze and packed with enough gunpowder to propel metal cannonballs with staggering force. More than 100,000 Ottoman soldiers now stood before the walls of Constantinople, braced for the greatest bombardment the history of warfare had ever known. Under relentless fire, the city's 7,000 Christian defenders held out for nearly a month. In desperation, the Byzantines who occupied the city appealed to their fellow Christians across the continent for help.
But of course, Europe in the 15th century was completely incapable of mounting any kind of a concerted opposition to the rising Turkish threat in the east.
And so, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, once the grandest city in the Western world, probably the grandest city outside of Imperial China, a shell of its former self by the 15th century, its population 1/8 maybe of what it had been at its height, is captured by Mehmet II, who becomes known as Mehmet the Conqueror. He makes it the capital of his empire, and it will be the capital of the empire right up until the collapse of that empire in the aftermath of World War I. It becomes known by a new name, Istanbul. And the government that is set up there is transferred from Bursa to Constantinople, is a remarkably effective one. The Ottomans are masters of bureaucracy. They're really very much ahead of their time in the 15th and 16th century far ahead of the states of Europe to the west. They have a cabinet which is essentially in control of the country, the empire, in the name of the Sultan, led by viziers, with a grand vizier at the top, kind of a prime minister. And it possesses an army that is arguably the best in the world, whose crack soldiers are the infantry, the so-called janissaries. Now, the interesting thing about this state is that almost all of the viziers and almost all of the elite janissary soldiers are not born Muslims. They're born Christians. Mainly Christians from the Balkans, from Croatia, Serbia, Albania especially. But they are taken into the Ottoman system as children through a program known as the Devshirme.
One of the bureaucratic, or let us say management problems facing the Ottomans was that there were still rival Muslim sort of proto-kingdoms around them. I mean, they were conquered by the Ottomans, but they had old grudges to bear. And they had certain claims to dynastic glory of their own. And they were constantly worried about these old Muslim families rising up and creating a rebellion. And so the story goes that they felt it would be imprudent to have the army made up of these sorts of people. And so they wanted to recruit children who were not connected with any rival Muslim family. And so they went into the Balkans and they recruited primarily Christian children.
This practice was called devshirme.
These children were then given the best possible education available in the world, perhaps, at the time. And they were then able to move into the highest positions of power in the empire.
Those who were brainy went to the palace schools and graduated into different levels of viziers and governors. It even became grand viziers. Those who were brawny went to the Janissary Corps.
The Janissaries were the Sultan's elite infantry. It was an army that would set the standard for centuries to come.
They were the strongest, trained as military machines, no fear of dying, totally fearless, and their only love was to serve the Sultan.
Now, technically, all of the viziers, all of the bureaucracy, all of the army are slaves. Now, that term has a lot of baggage in this country, for obvious reasons. This is less like slavery in the U.S. South and more like Europe in the Middle Ages. Many of you took possibly the AP Euro class with Mr. Rutledge, and you know that in the 1100s, the 1200s, 1300s, the way the world worked was you pledged your loyalty to a guy who was more powerful than you, and you pledged him military service, and he gave you land and gifts in exchange. It's closer to that, closer to feudalism in a way, than it is to what we would understand as such as West African slavery. And it's a very effective system because it creates a ruling class and army that is not factional. It's not beholden to any family or faction, or especially Muslim faction. These viziers and soldiers all are Muslim converts. It's a really remarkable solution to a seemingly intractable problem that the Ottoman sultans devise here with the Devshirme. This empire reaches its zenith in the 16th century under the rule of Suleiman. He's in the West called Suleiman the Magnificent. He comes to the throne as a young man in the year 1520 and will rule for nearly half a century.
He was born at the beginning of the 10th century by the Muslim calendar, and he was the 10th Sultan descended from Osman. He was a child of destiny, whose greatness was expected.
In the parlance of the day, he was the Sahib Quran, the universal ruler, the master of an auspicious conjunction whose coming has been foretold, whose identity is confirmed astrologically.
His name was Suleiman, after Solomon, the wise king of the Old Testament. The Ottoman Empire reached its apex under Suleiman's reign. Suleiman was 26 when he took the throne, determined to make his mark on the world, as soon as his ministers would let him. The way to prove his mettle was on the battlefield. Every new sultan was expected to begin his reign by expanding the empire. Ottomans now controlled Kurdistan, Egypt, and the holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Suleiman set his sights on Belgrade in Hungary, the stepping stone to Europe.
His conquest would push the boundaries of the empire towards Vienna in the north and towards Isfahan in Iran. But his legacy is really not as a conqueror. His legacy is much more as a patron of the arts, on the one hand, and as a lawgiver. And in fact, in Turkish, he's not known as Suleiman the Magnificent. He's known as Suleiman Kanuni, which means Suleiman the lawgiver.
Europe grew to fear the name of Suleiman. But within his own borders, he had another reputation. Islamic history remembers him as Kunan, the lawgiver.
Ottomans were really bureaucrats in full sense of the word. They kept every single record, and in order to control the different peoples who participated in the world of the Ottomans, they had to have very carefully sorted out legal systems.
Under Suleiman, a single legal system was defined for the sprawling empire. His laws would later become the basis of constitutions for several other nations.
Suleiman was the supreme monarch of the area. He was the center of the world.
He inaugurated a classical age in Ottoman architecture, commissioning some of the most spectacular buildings the world has ever seen.
Suleiman was in a unique position of wealth and of consolidation, and he focused his attention on developing monumental architecture to commemorate his great dynasty and himself.
Great religious architecture can really give people a sense of what is at the heart of the faith. Grandeur and majesty are the things that come to mind when Muslims think about God. A building that is grand and majestic can immediately remind people of the glory of God.
Suleiman's chief architect, Sinon, was a man whose vision perfectly complemented the empire builder. Sinon perfected the signature structure of Islam, the domed mosque. His career spanned half a century and produced well over 300 buildings. In including the refurbishment of one of the most important monuments in Islam, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem.
But for the Sultan, of course, he built his masterpiece, the Sultaniye Mosque in Istanbul. It is truly befitting Sinan, who's called the Great Master.
These buildings were horrendously expensive, huge things that took many, many years to build, and a great deal of architectural talent and engineering skill and engineering experience. When they built a mosque like the Sultaniye, they were doing it to say, yeah, I've got the power, I've got the money, I am the Sultan, I'm the King of Kings. But at the same time, there was also tremendous spiritual value in these things. The symbolism is not only that of empire, but of faith.
In the spirit of Muhammad's teaching, the Great Mosque was a center of social services, complete with a hospital, school, and library. At its inauguration, it said Suleiman gazed at it with awe and exclaimed, "O Solomon, I have surpassed thee." No less impressive was Suleiman's palace. Topkapi was both the seat of government and his private dwelling.
Suleiman was also a great patron of the arts. And since the empire was very rich, the best artisans were there. So everything started flourishing. The architecture or the art of his period show the first golden age of the Ottoman world. Everything that came out of his palace was exquisite. Suleiman himself was a goldsmith. Ottomans believed that every sultan had to have a tangible trade. Being a sultan was not considered a practical or a tangible trade. And he was a very demanding patron, insisted on checking the work, even commissioned few things. And I think each artisan group or each corps working for the palace tried to outdo one another to please the Sultan, because to please him had wonderful rewards.
The little anecdote there that when he enters the Sultaniye, which literally means Suleiman's mosque, the Aniya is like a possessive form in or suffix in Arabic. He says, "O Solomon, Solomon, son of David, the builder of the first temple in Jerusalem," says, "O Solomon, I have outdone thee." The interesting thing is he is consciously imitating a Roman emperor named Justinian, who had built essentially the model for the Sultaniye, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, all the way back in the 530s in the city of Constantinople. And when Justinian entered the Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom Church, the first time, he allegedly said, "O Solomon, I have outdone thee," in the same city 1,000 years apart. So let's look at the Sultaniye. It is one of the great architectural masterpieces of the Ottoman Empire. It is an enormous structure. The scale here is difficult to really put into words. A huge dome surmounting dozens of other domes, a massive space for worship in this city that is once again home to hundreds of thousands of people. Constantinople was really reborn after 1453 as a great imperial city once again under the rule of the Ottomans. And it's under the sultans, but especially under Suleiman Kanuni, or the Magnificent, that the great palace of the Ottomans is built on the southern tip of the peninsula of Istanbul, of Constantinople, the Topkapi Palace, which will eventually encompass 7 million square feet. And it's here that you find the harem. The West sexualized the harem. It became this erotic pleasure center. But that's not really what it's about. The term actually means a place apart, a sacred, special place. It has no sexual connotations by definition in Arabic. So let's go into Suleiman's harem.
But for power and ambition, the secret world of the Sultan's harem had no equal. Contrary to the Western stereotype, it was not the Sultan's playpen, but lay at the center of dynastic power.
The harem was the private quarters of the Sultan. We tend to think of the harem as where the women live, but what it means is the place where you're not on display. Home is what it means.
Islam allowed the Sultan 4 wives and many concubines.
It was a system designed to produce heirs, is what it was. When you look into the actual details of how these things were carried out, it was hardly anything terribly erotic. I mean, the Sultan did not have much choice in his selection of female companions. The Sultan was not in a position to look around and say, I want her, because his mother would have a lot to say about it.
With his first wife, Suleiman had a son and heir, Mustafa. But while he was in his mid-30s, the Sultan fell deeply in love with a Slavic slave girl named Harem. In the West, we know her by a different name, Roxolana. Roxolana would bear him a rival heir and become Suleiman's most trusted confidant.
The Sultan was supposed to be protected from any undue influences. He was supposed to be protected from any rivals. And in a way, this creates a vacuum around his person into which the harem life can enter. And so the fact that he was so protected works in a funny way to expose him to the influence of his female companions with whom he spent so much time. And there were tremendously intelligent and ambitious women around him, Roxolana being the most famous of all.
So, you have in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century the most powerful state probably in the world, because at this point the Chinese Empire is beginning to wane. Reaches its apex under Suleiman in the middle of the 16th century. But it, to an outside observer, we looking back on it, historians can say, well, you can start to see signs of decay by the 17th century. But to the outside observer, that would not have been clear at all. And in fact, as late as 1683, the armies of the Sultan besieged the city of Vienna, the Habsburg capital. This is less than 100 years before the American Revolution. But fast forward 100 years to the late 18th century and disastrous wars against Russia, against Austria, discussed in Cleveland, resulting in humiliating treaties like the Treaty of Karlowitz, for example, will begin to strip the Ottoman sultans of their European possessions, little by little, moving closer and closer to Constantinople, so that by the 19th century, the European countries have far surpassed Constantinople, Istanbul in power, in no small part because of the Industrial Revolution. There is no Industrial Revolution in the Ottoman Empire. There's virtually no printing presses in the Ottoman Empire for a very, very long time. And much as the great Chinese Empire begins to wither on the vine because it resists change and outside influence, the same thing really happens here in Istanbul. So that what we'll be discussing in class on Thursday, this fragmentation and beginnings of European domination are truly a feature of the 19th century. So what have we learned? Well, we met two great sultans. Mehmed II, a man who conquers Constantinople in 1453, earning him the sobriquet the Conqueror, and Suleiman, known in the West as the Magnificent, known to his subjects as Kanuni, the Lawgiver. Rules for almost half a century in the 1500s. We saw the interesting bureaucratic solution to the problem of family and Muslim rivalries within the empire via the devshirmen, by recruiting / kidnapping, it gets a little hazy, Christian children in the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and bringing them up as quote-unquote slaves of the Sultan to serve in the army, the Janissaries, and to serve in the bureaucracy all the way up to the rank of Grand Vizier, like a prime minister. A remarkably effective system. 4 centuries. It's really not until the 19th century, you'll read about this in Cleveland, that the Janissaries become a self-perpetuating oligarchy, and the power of the Ottoman army is on the decline. So, what we're going to do on Thursday and Friday of next week is we're going to really look at the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century. So we're going to combine Ottoman Empire reform and Egypt breaks away. Now it's a lot of reading, so get started on it. You've got basically from page 53 to 93 in Cleveland. I've broken it up like this because it's thematically better this way. So you got 53 to 58, 69 to 74, 75 to 86, 93 to 94. And we've got one piece of primary source evidence that we're going to discuss in class on Thursday on attempt to modernize in 1839, the noble rescript, the Hatta Sharif, issued by the Sultan, an attempt to catch up to Europe. And then on Friday, we'll talk about the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century, under the rule of Abdul Hamid and the rise of the so-called Young Turks. Modernizers attempting to bring European change into the Ottoman Empire. It's titled The Sick Man of Europe because that's what Europeans called the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It had become a second-rate state compared to Germany, compared to France, Russia, and really especially England. So, Thursday, Friday. Now, it's a lot of reading, but you can do it. I believe in you.